Nice. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner is widely considered to be one of the best pieces of science fiction, period. While it needs little introduction or explanation of its legacy, what's lesser known is that it was actually a box office flop upon release, undervalued for years, and therefore a sequel looked unlikely for many of them. Based on Philip K. Dick's novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, it follows a hunter of synthetic androids known as replicants in a dystopian Los Angeles. It's a noir fiction-inspired philosophical meditation on the meaning of humanity amongst the existence of artificial life, and against the backdrop of stark ecological decline. Its sequel rights eluded would-be filmmakers for a number of years, finally being secured by Alcon Entertainment in the early 2010s. News of its casting came over 30 years after the original, with Harrison Ford returning as now retired Blade Runner Rick Deckard and Ryan Gosling as main protagonist Kay, aptly set 30 years later. Scott stayed on in a producer role, and directorial duties went to Denis Villeneuve after huge acclaim for his brooding and atmospheric pictures Prisoner Sicario and Arrival, with his preferred composer Johan Johansson attached to score. However, mere months before the film's release, it was announced that Benjamin Wallfisch and Hans Zimmer had taken over scoring duties from Johan Johansson after his surprise departure from the project. 2049's materialization followed hot on the heels of Ford's other monumental return to a classic franchise in his appearance in 2015's The Force Awakens. Yet another classic franchise was getting a sequel, reboot, requel thing for the third time in 9 years, at a time where franchise media, not yet entirely succumbing to audience fatigue, was certainly starting to show some signs. While 2049 is perhaps one of the more successful requel offerings, like its contemporaries, any criticism of its content, including that of its music, necessitates a degree of comparative analysis. So a requel is a revisit to a pre-existing, likely cherished universe, being any combination of a continuation of prior narratives and themes, an expansion upon their aesthetic or thematic content in a contemporary context, while ideally pleasing existing fan bases with the correct number of nostalgic nods.
Remember TIE Fighters? Oh, remember Jawas? Remember? Hey, remember Jurassic Park? Oh, you love Jurassic Park.
Inviting in new fans and achieving the seemingly impossible task of keeping everyone happy. A musical score for such an iconic film needs to share in this multiplicity of aspirations. As we'll explore, 2049 aims to pay homage to the franchise universe's pre-existing sound world while making it aesthetically and technologically cohesive with the wider film landscape in this new era. These considerations seemingly permeated all departments. Sound editor on 2049, Mark Mangini, stated in regards to the iconic aural signature of the original film's sound design, "I struggled with how to honor that and be original at the same time. I think that was always our big challenge." Cinematographer Roger Deakins was also not immune from these considerations. The idea was to make a unique movie that could stand alone and be in relationship with the first one. But Vangelis' legendary score for Blade Runner was one of the key ingredients of the iconic and cult status of that film, stemming from his then cutting-edge use of technology to recontextualize its jazz noir and Middle Eastern influences. Existing loyal fandoms may be more keen on a continuation of the existing story in that sequel camp.
I am a Sentinel.
As a reboot may be seen as a mere commercial exploitation. Alternatively, a reboot may be preferable to allow the original to sit in isolation, quarantined safely away from new narratives that might be seen to undo their beloved characters' arcs. This balancing act is made all the more treacherous in light of our current social media-driven, algorithmically amplified discourse and criticism. And a score as cherished as that of Blade Runner's absolutely attracts this same level of fervor. So, if you're here, Hans Zimmer likely needs less of an introduction than Blade Runner does. As a two-time Oscar winner from 12 nominations, the frequency of his output is formidable, having scored over 110 films, grossing over $33 billion at the time of recording. And as I'm sure, due to this prominence, it won't be the last time we discuss one of his scores. Wallfisch, though, has an extensive repertoire of his own, coming into particular prominence in the last decade, with scores for a plethora of other reboots. But his involvement in the industry reaches much farther back. As an orchestrator and conductor, including a number of Zimmer's own scores. Importantly, though, he was a composer in the Zimmer-owned Remote Control Productions, a scoring powerhouse of incredibly talented composers whose work for the company is mentored by and eventually credited to Hans Zimmer himself. While this method of ghost composition has certainly come under some scrutiny in recent years and may go some way to explain the frequency of that output, it clearly provides some incredibly fruitful creative relationships. Since Johansson's departure, there's been significant online speculation over supposedly leaked audio of Johansson's intended score for 2049. A posthumous release called the Gold Dust EP is frequently cited as unused music for Blade Runner 2049 and has repeatedly been edited to the finished film. Many have marveled at the seemingly perfect synchronicity with the picture, all but confirming its intended use.
Where are we going?
Home.
A few moments later.
But despite some fortuitous hit points, the Gold Dust's EP's metadata suggests these tracks were composed for Johansson's unused score for Darren Aronofsky's Mother. After a little more digging, though, it appears Jóhann Johansson's music was shown the light of day in 2022, or as much light of day as you can get when your estate decides to release it as NFTs. Unlike the Gold Dust EP, oriented around some classic Johanssonisms, his 2049 music provides far less stylistic contrast to Zimmer and Waldfisch's work than some online romantics may have hoped for. From these snippets, we can hear that both scores are largely electronic in instrumentation, ambient in arrangement, and suitably brooding in tone. Even a few stings of audio here and there seem to have made the cut, or at least heavily influenced Zimmer and Waldfisch, particularly this bass synth in octaves playing a minor third interval with a heavy LFO. Or even this plucked kind of texture outside the replicant brothel. But whether it was the creative or the executive powers that be, the old art versus commerce debate, they deemed Johansson's work to be unsuitable. On his departure, Villeneuve stated, "Making a movie is like a laboratory, and you cannot plan things. Jóhann Johansson is one of my favorite composers. He is a very strong artist, but the movie needed something different. Perhaps alongside the updated visual language, the new narrative, and the absence of any pre-existing characters for 35 minutes of the film, a totally novel approach to the score as well would have the film feel too incohesive with Blade Runner." So in that respect, then, it paradoxically depends on the score to provide the most connective tissue to the original film, seemingly the antithesis to Johansson's original intentions, and presumably a difficult task for such an idiosyncratic voice. Zimmer and Waldfisch decided that the key to their spiritual homage to Vangelis lay in the Yamaha CS80 synthesizer. It's a legend in the analog synth world, used by Vangelis for the vast majority of the original film's sonic palette, describing it as the most important synthesizer of his career. And for him, the best analog synthesizer design there has ever been. Its versatility and distinct character was also favored by a number of pop producers of that era, so it's featured on some pretty iconic pop tunes as well. Now, there are 42 years worth of discourse as to the importance of this synthesizer for the original Blade Runner and therefore sci-fi more widely. So to be very brief, along with an extensive array of oscillators, filters, programmable presets, and 8-voice polyphony, the synth also featured a ribbon controller and aftertouch, allowing the player to slide continuously between discrete note values, accessing a theoretically infinite number of frequencies between them. This makes glissandi, or pitch bends, behave much more naturally, more like a stringed instrument, in the way an Ons Martenot, or aptly for sci-fi, the theremin, had previously. The aftertouch then allows more pressure on the keys after pressing them to add some expressive vibrato to the playing.
At the same time, this sound, you can bring feeling.
The ribbon controller and aftertouch were just two key features of the synthesizer that allowed Vangelis an unprecedented level of human performance from pitches created by a machine. Life out of the machine is obviously a central philosophical tenet of most sci-fi, particularly that inspired by Philip K. Dick's Replicants or Asimov's Positronic Robots, questioning what makes us human and machine life artificial. What better or more poetic method to describe these questions than music technology itself? In essence, the idea of human artistic musical expression rendered through the inorganic, the man-made. Synthesizers in scoring and sound design certainly weren't pioneered by Vangelis, but he was arguably a trendsetter in wielding them for this metaphorical use and therefore that inherent emotional value. In this context, then, it's understandable why Johansson's more atmospheric ideas were eschewed in favor of something closer to Vangelis. It's not only more appropriate for a Blade Runner sequel in context with Vangelis's pre-established sound world, but more widely as a philosophical science fiction picture due to the poetic element imbued in that narrative instrument combination by the lasting legacy of Vangelis's use of it. Equally poetic is the meta-narrative idea that Zimmer and Waalfrisch, exactly like Neander Wallace, returning to the source of who was originally able to imbue humanity into the machine. Vangelis and Tyrell both aim to capture a bygone magic that could elude them. And like Wallace, Zimmer and Waalfrisch's inspiration, if misused, could lead to derivation, dilution, rebellion. Key to 2049's re-rendering of this world is its heightened sense of scale and generally upped stakes. We see dystopian deterioration right across California and into Las Vegas. We see the once great pyramid-esque Tyrell Corporation building, recalling that visual motif of conglomerate pharaohs playing God with robotics, now dwarfed by that of its successor, the Wallace Corporation. Faithful to its noir fiction archetypes, even elements of sex and violence feel harder or more depraved. The Voight-Kampff test has a new analogue in the baseline test, from interview to interrogation. Villeneuve and screenwriters Fancher and Green call upon some contemporary issues. Our social media has a surrogate in AI companionships, drip-feeding Kay everything that he wants to hear, confirming his biases in his little echo chamber.
I'm so happy when I'm with you. You're special. You look lonely. I can fix that.
Kay is the perfect mirror for this theme. As a confirmed replicant, this artificial relationship is the only one that's available to him, at least where he's not being exploited in some way.
What happens if I finish that?
These contemporary themes are all included while still allowing the world we see on screen to feel like a degraded version of the retro future we saw in Blade Runner's rendering of 2019, a kind of neo-retrofuturism. It even snows now. All of this visual and narrative amplification then needs reflection in its sonic palette. Since 1982, filmmaking technologies have progressed massively, with digital workflows allowing a degree of audiovisual fidelity leaps and bounds above what was available back then, particularly as Blade Runner found much of its cult prominence on the small screen via VHS. The dynamism of volume and bass content in particular available to us on these new modern systems that Alan Mayerson absolutely exploited for the score mix is a primary tool in how scale is felt viscerally from both score and sound design in 2049. Particularly in context with Villeneuve's championing of the cinema experience over home viewing or streaming. McGlynn is referring to sound in this context as having haptic qualities and as a bodily and physiological engagement with the film. Through this, that sense of enlarged scale becomes very tactile. Zimmer and Waalfrisch don't shy away from this strong bass content in more intimate scenes, like when Kay is pondering the authenticity of one of his memories in the orphanage, or even the very moving love scene where Kay is able to be intimate with Joy for the first time. These choices may be simply to comply with more modern production conventions, or perhaps catering to audience tastes in the wake of bass-intensive pop genres. But intentionally or not, this tactile sonic amplification does mirror those varying thematic amplifications of worse isolation, more tyranny, and more oppression. Blade Runner became synonymous on one hand with its pad-like synthesis and percussive textures, where its rubato performance, largely improvised over the film by Vangelis at his own pace, gave a sonority which was firmly ambient in nature. But it was also a deeply melodic score, particularly in its film noir-inspired saxophone, both real and synthesized. Some of the more overt non-Western flourishes in the score are also largely melodic devices, with an alien or foreign compositional complexity due to their allusions to microtonality, the Phrygian mode, and their pseudo-Arabic sung phrases. For better or worse, though, 2049 omits most of these influences with only subtle melodic nods, or as McGlynn referred to them as intervallic details, pertaining to a common use of the space between notes in a melody to signify its shared identity. This may be because the Blade Runner universe has already been established, and its as-then foreign cultures require much less world building through this melody. Such opaque musical signifiers may also feel just too on the nose now in the more globalized society which we live in. It could be because of the contemporary context of the wider film landscape, orienting itself around a more post-minimal refrain from melodic complexity. There's also the possibility of contemporary identity, political considerations of authenticity for composers channeling cultures to which they don't directly belong themselves. But the allusions to melody we do get in 2049 are no less meaningful for that, even if they are less complex. A score without overtly emotive melodies works in favor of a world without rich emotional connections and a cold world of impregnable corporate might. Both title crawls start with a huge industrial drum hit through a canyon reverb. The expository text that follows in 2049, however, is accompanied by a much less abstract, more conventionally musical descending motif on the piano. Its harmonic allusion from C# minor to C to F#7 to E flat becomes an expositionary theme of sorts through later repetitions, most notably when Kay finds out the truth about the child. Its delicate texture but constant key modulations suggest an ever-changing set of variables, almost like breadcrumbs that Kay spends the film following. The piano, importantly, is a visual and sonic motif in both films. It's where Deckard ponders the unicorn memory. It's where Rachel plays Chopin based on her implanted memories. And in 2049, it's where Kay finds Sapper's very emotional memento to the miracle he witnessed.
Because you've never seen a miracle.
And where he instinctively goes to when looking for Deckard. So in many ways, both Replicant and Vangelis use this keyboard in some way to denote soul from the artificial. In Blade Runner, the droning root note of E cements the key center for this sequence. With an ascending harmonic movement through suspended seconds over the drone. The ribbon controller on the CS80 can then come into play for these descending glissandi ornaments, punctuating and closing out the various phrases. And together, they wonderfully trace the on-screen movement of the spinners takeoff and landing, ascent and descent. 2049's opening synth overture feels immediately far more lacking in wonder and warmth, with more melancholy in its synth line over the C# drone. Its melody, though very sparse, should be referred to as such due to its thematic importance. Valfish called it the soul theme, and it's repeated throughout the film but recontextualized later on, transposed to G minor and played delicately on flutes. In those cues, it accompanies more poignant moments of inner reflection on the authenticity of Kay's humanity, the tragedy of Rachel's death, and subsequent separation of father and child. It's certainly the emotive heart of melody in the score, despite its melodic minimalism. The soul theme consists of an accidental major third, so in the opening, an E sharp, which gives a kind of wistful quality in context of the minor 6th to 5th resolution. At the start of the film, the soul theme never actually completes its full cycle, potentially symbolic of Kay not yet knowing the full extent of his arc, while in the later G minor iterations, when there's much more expositionary material, the theme then completes. He learns the truth. I think the minimalism of this melody is key to its versatility, as it's able to feel intimate or grand, cold or warm, depending on how it's played, on what instrumentation, and how it's orchestrated. The lack of chordal harmony, like Vangelis, portrays a suitable coldness for these barren expanses that we're seeing, and this new climate, because if you didn't know, it snows now. This is in contrast to its predecessor's sense of buoyancy, which, despite its own dismal dystopian depiction, still gave a sense of novel wonder for the as-then unestablished Blade Runner universe. But us flying cars surprise no longer. The soul theme's harmonic language returns to bookend the film, where that E sharp really lends a sense of catharsis to Kay's finally realized selfless purpose, though here it's punctuated by these visceral bass slides. They help provide the sonic muscularity in the music that is emblematic of the love character, her incredible physical strength and will to please Wallace.
I'm the best one.
Zimmer and Valfish do take greater influence from Vangelis's warmer harmonies, though, in their own flying scene in the cue Mesa. It follows Joy's first road trip with Kay, and this company probably helps explain the choice to make it much warmer through its harmonies. They're able to encapsulate much of Vangelis's opening theme's levity, moving through ascending chords in the harmony over the subdominant root note. Vangelis used a 1, 2 to 5 chord movement, whereas Zimmer and Valfish use a 4, 5 to minor 6th chord movement. But melodically, Mesa is much more akin to the iconic cue Tears in Rain that accompanied Roy Batty's selfless death. They both share a C major key center, both move predominantly between the 1 and 4 chord, so C to F, and both really highlight the major third of A over the subdominant F chord. Tears in Rain, though, is more delicately played on a Celeste-like tone, while Mesa is timbrally much more aligned to the grand opening synth cue. The Celeste-like element of Tears in Rain is mimicked much more obviously in The Closest Thing 2049 Has to a Love theme. In Joy or Rain, its harmony is simple and diatonic, moving from a 6th chord of E minor to its G major key center. The simple, delicate 5-note motif returns for the love scene and is perhaps the most overt simplification between common themes between the two films. The love theme in Blade Runner, which plays under the image of Rachel letting her hair down, a vulnerable inversion of that noir femme fatale, is a sultry, saxophone-led, jazz noir-inspired piece played so expressively by Dick Morrissey. It feels instinctively of a different era now. There's also a great deal more harmonic modulation as the scene progresses, outlining how the scene meanders through more ambiguous moral considerations, as we see Deckard roughly coerce the vulnerable Rachel, an image we'd likely find more jarring as time has passed. Perhaps the simplest but no less menacing motif in the film is that of Neander Wallace, our big bad. Contrabass vocalist Avi Kaplan of Pentatonix fame provides an incredibly deep movement between G-sharp 2, E2, and C-sharp 2.
And your new models are be scraping the shit. Because you've never seen a miracle.
This, along with some overtone singing, is very reminiscent of the Ka-Gira register of Tuvan throat singing. This exceptionally low register gives an otherworldly or off-worldly quality. A kind of alien connotation used incredibly effectively in Dune with the Sardaukar chant. Though potentially an oversimplification, this method of singing in Tuvan culture is tied to the inherent spirituality in everyday objects or facets of nature. So there's an implicit symbolism in channeling this device as an emblem of the maker of replicants, by extension, the one who imbues them with consciousness and therefore perhaps a spirit or a soul. This provides us with a suitable otherness, though rather than signifying any kind of foreign culture, it foreshadows an otherworldly cruelty in Wallace. As important as music's presence is in 2049, both narratively and atmospherically, the latter is aided on occasion by its absence. In the opening scene, tension simmers in the absence of any aural signifiers, a silent understanding of the inevitable conclusion to their escalating dialogue. And we feel this despite a lack of music. It's a principle that the more ambient parts of the score functions on, in portraying an allusion to a literal in-world ambience. Throughout the score, there's a prevalence of an implied atmosphere, either via diegetic sound or an abstract, musically sourced embodiment of the implied sound world. McGlynn channels Castanel's notion of the hyper-orchestra as a means by which, faithful to Vangelis' example, Zimmer and Wallfisch, along with sound designer Mark Mangini, use musically derived but technologically manipulated textural content.
I think what I appreciate most about the first film is that it created moods using sound effects and music, and sometimes you didn't really know which was which. I discovered really interesting things that Vangelis had made that you thought were environmental textures that the sound designer had made, and vice versa.
They constantly saturate the multisensory soundscape with a symbiotic and then perhaps a synergistic aural presence, superseding what is able to be done from two distinct practices of sound design and music. Zimmer and Wallfisch have come under some scrutiny for this score, not merely from Johansson loyalists who mourn the loss of one of his final scores. Much of the criticism is around a lack of sentimentality that was attained by Vangelis, presumably from the melodic aspect of his writing, the warmth in his harmonies, and the then novel approach to humanize electronic music. Other criticisms of the music are far more entangled with a wider consideration of the film in how it treats and empathizes with its female characters. The film is a continuation of the misogynistic dystopia established in 1982, where females, and more widely replicant subservience, is woven into the fabric of that society. We're supposed to be repelled at the absence of their agency and the tyrannical systems they're trapped in. It's integral to the film's allegiance to that continued neo-retrofuturism, so a lack of a classical emotional sensibility in its music makes sense. The compositional contrast to Vangelis also helps to make Kay's character distinct from Deckard's, where Kay's lack of anything resembling humor can be expressed musically in the ominous, the brooding, subtle, particularly in the pop cultural context of Gosling's archetypal stoic everyman, whose memeified non-emotionality has become an ironic, not ironic emblem for internet nihilism. A more emotively restrained style of writing is fitting to this character. Perhaps his previous roles, particularly in Drive, and that film's sonic backdrop with Martinez's very ambient score, there too set a cultural benchmark for how audiences expect to sonically receive these actors and these character tropes. It's mirrored closely in other predominantly male stoic archetypal figures in contemporary film and TV, and could be interpreted now as its own musical code, even if only subconsciously decoded. Despite its restriction to a contemporary melodic sensibility, some of the most emotionally captivating and cathartic music in 2049 is attributed to its female characters. They are set up to be the figureheads in The Storm That's Coming, where a female replicant has the agency to lead the wider replicant army to liberation.
I want to free our people.
It may be done so with a musical subtlety, but its refrain from overt emotionality is perfectly deployed for its equally stoic female characters, particularly in this ever more oppressive iteration of this universe. While Blade Runner 2049's score may appear simplified in comparison to its predecessor, it proves highly effective in both its narrative alignment and within the framework of contemporary cinematic conventions. Its deliberate restraint in melody and overall presence, coupled with its subtle emotional depth, mirrors the necessary stoicism of its characters and soulless dystopian world they inhabit. Whereas the original Blade Runner sought to evoke a sense of humanity within its replicants, 2049 reveals their capacity for a very human form of numbness and apathy. The score deftly incorporates modern production techniques, blending it in necessary power and intensity as exemplified by the love character, all while forging its own identity and paying homage to Vangelis's pioneering work with both respect and reverence. The impossibility of matching that groundbreaking innovation of the original score is rooted in that score's unique position at the time of a technological advent, which cannot be replicated in a music technologically saturated 21st century. This once-in-a-generation achievement remains an integral part of Blade Runner's legacy, influencing every aspect of 2049's production. Although Blade Runner 2049, like its predecessor, was a commercial disappointment upon release, it's a work that demands repeated viewings and listenings. With time, its score may come to be as cherished by wider audiences as it already is amongst its cult following, a recognition it undoubtedly deserves. So thank you so much if you've made it this far. I really appreciate the support. It's been such a joy to explore why this score affected me so viscerally when I saw it in the cinema 7 years ago, and how it still affects me on every repeated view. Please leave a comment around what film you'd like me to cover next. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Part 2, we're going to be exploring the incredible cue Seawall. It's the last cue before their quotation of Tears in Rain upon Kay's death. Spoilers. But if you've made it this far, incredibly powerful cue. So stick around for that, and I'll see you in part 2.